Morning guys, it's a frosty December the 2nd. I have a bird's nest. I've removed the metal box that the Genisys modules and the relays and bits and pieces are in. It wasn't going to be possible to get it out in one piece. I took an angle grinder to it simply because I had cables coming into it in three directions and I didn't want to disconnect absolutely every single pin in order to pull them out of these nice big thick cable management glands. That would have taken forever. Typical ambulance. I've got cables, you can see that hole there. There's cables running under the mat. And I will need to either remove the mat or at least lift the mat up enough that I can get these cables out. They're actually cable tied together and taped together. So the chances are I wouldn't be able to pull them out individually. You've got an antenna cable there which basically extended the antenna from the radio. That's the plug that's actually in the cable harness of the vehicle. You've got the original blue Cat5 cable that went to Genisys. Why somebody run a white one, I don't know. But that white one was basically replacing what this one does. Then there's a bunch of wires there that come from the Iveco bodybuilders interface, which I'll show you in a minute. In this van, I've got this big red button here, which is a chassis battery isolator. It's a factory fit option by Iveco. And I've also got this little aircraft style ejector button. That's the one that actually turns off the auxiliary batteries. And so I can isolate the chassis battery and the auxiliary battery from the dashboard. But whenever you're stripping out wiring, ex-ambulance wiring, you're looking for things that may still be live. And I found this bit of tape, bit of suspicious black tape here, when I removed the cover from the ignition switch. And there's a inline fuse which has a 10 amp fuse in it, which is worth mentioning because it's way too much for what it's actually doing. And that cable feeds a thing which is obviously a cigarette socket plug that they've wired and soldered the wires directly to, and that was all wrapped up in your typical telltale pile of black tape and cable ties. And what this is a TomTom sat-nav power supply. So it provides 5 volts via a USB connector, and the USB connector is coming out of that telltale hole with another cable tie, goes up there, and it's actually sitting on top of the dashboard. But it's live. You can see the green light on. And it's stuff like this that you need to basically make the effort to find under the dashboard in your ex-ambulance. You don't know if the decommissioning vandals have chopped off cables or they've left stuff live. You don't know if the stuff's under there. There may be GPS modules, trackers, things. I don't know. You know, it varies. You often find stuff under the dashboard that may or may not be live, but ideally needs removing. But this thing's live. This battery charger at the moment, there's no TomTom plugged into it. It's just producing 5 volts and there's a light on. But it's pulling current off the chassis battery. And over time, this is just adding to the overall amount of parasitic load on the chassis battery. So, in the first instance, out comes the fuse. Dead. So that's one little load removed. Let's take a wander around the other side. Look at it. Afternoon and it's still frosty on the crafter. Brr. Up here, under the dash, or under the glove box, is where Iveco keep these blue cables. There's 2 of them. Blue connectors, rather. There's 2 of them. These are for the bodybuilder's interface. These provide the information that goes to those connectors I was referring to the other day in the previous video. There's 2 of them, this one here and that one there, and you can see the labelling on them. Ignition, etc. Door switches, handbrake. Some of those wires are spliced off that connector and go to Genisys to provide Genisys with the information, but it also went to a cable that ran up there, up there, up there, and up into that overhead locker up there. And I've taken the front panel off of that now because I've been clearing out more squirrels up in this corner here, more squirrel nuts and seeds and rubbish and bloody things. And I wouldn't be surprised if they got in the headlining, so I'm going to have to take the headlining down. Well, I'm going to have to take it down anyway because I need to remove this brigade monitor because of, it's faulty and the rubber around it's gone horribly sticky, and the wire, which is that black wire there, which goes to that microphone. Can you see it? Probably not. There's a microphone up there anyway. On this side, there is a telltale cable there, which goes to the earth point, and another bunch of tape and a fuse, which goes to a connection just inside there, below that cross. X marks the spot. Interesting, isn't it? And I need to find out what that does. It goes to a relay up in there somewhere. Again, I will work out what it does. But the main purpose of taking the metal box out is to be able to get at that load of cables there, because all of those need to come out. I'm putting a walkway through. I'll be cutting this down, almost down to the floor here, putting a walkway through. You don't want to be walking on cables that may or may not be well protected. You just don't know. So they've got to come out. And any of those cables that I do need to keep, some of them going from the body builds into the face, I will instead run them up the door pillar, down the side, and then down in the corner and back to the wherever I put Genisys, which will probably up on this wall somewhere. Now, in this van, as I said, I showed you just now, I've got isolator switches. I can isolate the chassis battery and the auxiliary batteries at the back, but never assume that everything's isolated. I've got the plus 12 volts. In this van they've used black cables for everything. The only identifier is it's got a bit of red heat shrink at the end, but I've stuck a piece of conduit on the end of it just to insulate it. But as I said, never assume everything's dead. Even though it's isolated, I know that unless I disconnect the batteries, and it's always good practice to disconnect the batteries whenever you're working on vehicles, but I know that Genisys uses these signals here, AN1, AN2, AN3 and AN4. This is what Genisys uses to monitor the voltage of the batteries, and this is what Helga will then use as a value to say your chassis battery is flat, start the engine, and so on and so forth. Bit weird that it says chassis battery twice here. I'm not sure why they've got two signals there. If I measure the voltage on the pins of the plug, this plug here, the big plug, if I measure the voltage on those two pins there, there's 12.5 volts on those at the moment. They're both identical voltages. It may well be that if I push the chassis isolator button, because it's not on at the moment, if I pushed it, it may be one of these goes off and one of them remains live. I don't know. But it's a bit weird that it seems to be monitoring the chassis battery twice. And even though I've got two auxiliary batteries in this van, it only monitors one of them. Very odd. You'll always find quirks in Genisys. Every vehicle varies, and sometimes the labels don't quite mean what you think they do, so it could well be that that's going to something else, but I'm pretty certain they're both chassis battery. But I know, as I said, at the moment, even though the buttons are pushed, I know those pins are live. It's highly unlikely anything else is live there, but I do know those are live. You just need to bear in mind that even when the thing's isolated, if you're not certain, physically disconnect the batteries. As I said, I'm going to be taking the mat out if I can get it out. It's a bit difficult on a Sprinter and on the Fiat. Dead easy to get the mat out, but in the daily, it's not easy to get the mat out. They have these plastic fittings here, and there's another one over there, which are really hard to remove. They almost like they must have put the dashboard in after these trim pieces were in place. But as long as I can get the mat high enough so that I can get my hands to that cable harness there and release the cable ties and undo all the tape or whatever they got it bundled up with, I'll be able to get that cable out. I'm lucky in this vehicle, no rust in the step area at all. Typically Sprinters and Crafters suffer terribly from step rust, which can eventually rust all the way through if you're not careful. It's the way the plastic, I've done a video about it, but it's the way the plastic seems to press down on the paintwork. It creates holes which eventually get rusty, especially if they get very, very wet. But you can see this one, there's a bit of dirt there, but other than that it's very, very clean. And I'm also lucky that partly because of the fact this van's only done 30,000 miles, but also because it wasn't a frontline ambulance, they probably weren't eating meals in here and drinking. So there's very little filth to deal with. In most A&E ambulances, especially high mileage, you really do need to get this mat out and clean the floor. They eat, you know, they drop drinks, and every vehicle I've ever taken apart, these mats have a kind of a foam backing on them that's normally saturated with drinks and water and food. It's just horrible. Smells, it's unhygienic. It's worth having the mat out and cleaning it. And so if I can get this mat out, I will, but I know, having lifted up the edges, it's dirty, there's dust and stuff, but it's not yuck. And the emphasis is on word yuck. So there you go. There's my bird nest. It doesn't bother me in the slightest, that. I know exactly what everything does. And it's all just sitting there quite happily until I decide to either reposition it, or more than likely I'll end up taking quite a lot of wires out before actually re-terminating everything else, because there's probably 50% of the cables here I don't need, or 50% of those 50%, some of them are going to get wired back to manual switches or fuses, such as the heater. Anyway, there you go. Quick update for today. Oh, the sun's come out again. It's too bloody cold to do much work, so I thought I'd just do a little film about it and tell you about checking for your parasitic loads. Thanks for watching.